They laughed when he told her to kneel, and by morning, no one in that town would dare say his name the same way again, because in Dry Creek, respect was measured in land and silence, and Caleb Whitaker had both, or at least he believed he did, standing in the center of the street with the sun pressing down like a hand on his shoulders, dust drifting lazily around his boots, as if even the wind answered to him, his voice cutting through the quiet like something practiced, something used to being obeyed. "You want water, you earn it," he said, not loud, not angry, just certain, and the people around him shifted, not because they were surprised, but because they weren't, because this was how things worked here, because a man who built something out of nothing believed he owned everything that stood on it, including the right to decide who deserved a drink. And the woman in front of him didn't look like someone who deserved anything in their eyes, her dress worn thin by miles of walking, her boots cracked, her hair pulled back without care, dust clinging to her skin like it had chosen her. And yet she didn't look at the crowd, didn't glance at the saloon doors or the men leaning against the rail. She looked at the ground, the same ground Caleb stood on, and when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't weak, it was steady, almost quiet enough to miss. "Is this still Redbird land?" And that question should have stopped something, should have made someone shift their weight or clear their throat, but instead it drew a laugh, low at first, then spreading, because to them it sounded like nonsense, like something from a story that didn't matter anymore. And Caleb smiled in that slow way that meant he'd already decided the ending, tipping his hat back just enough to study her face. "This land belongs to whoever can hold it," he said, and there was a pause, not long, just enough for the air to tighten, before he flicked a silver coin from his fingers, the metal spinning once, before landing in the dust between them, catching the sunlight like it was part of the show. "Pick it up," he added, and somewhere behind him a man chuckled. Another muttered something about pride being expensive, but the woman didn't move right away. She looked down at the coin, then past it, to the dirt beneath, and slowly, carefully, she lowered herself, her knees pressing into the dry earth, the sound soft but carrying in a way no one expected. And for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away, because she didn't kneel like someone begging. She touched the ground like it mattered, like it recognized her, her fingers brushing through the dust in a way that felt deliberate, almost like a greeting, and Caleb didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to, because noticing would mean questioning, and questioning was something men like him learned to avoid. And when she finally picked up the coin, she held it for just a second too long before standing, her eyes meeting his not with anger, not with fear, but with something harder to place, something that didn't belong to this moment at all. And then she turned and walked away, leaving the coin in her hand and the town behind her without another word. And the laughter came back, softer this time, like it needed to convince itself, but the dust didn't settle the same way after that. And as the sun dipped and the shadows stretched long across Dry Creek, something else began to move at the edges of things, something that didn't ask for permission, something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. By the time the last lights slipped behind the low hills, Dry Creek had gone quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that sits wrong in your bones, and Caleb Whitaker felt it even as he sat on the edge of his porch, boots planted firm against the wooden boards he had paid for, built, and claimed as his own, the smell of dust and old timber hanging in the air like it always did, except tonight it felt heavier, like something unseen had settled into the cracks between things, and he told himself it was nothing, just the heat lingering after a long day, just the echo of laughter fading slower than it should. But his eyes kept drifting toward the road she had taken, the long stretch of dry land that led out into open country where most folks did not travel without reason, and she had not looked like someone wandering without one, not with the way she moved, steady, unhurried, like every step already knew where it would land before it touched the ground. And that question she asked lingered in his head longer than it should have, not because of the words themselves, but because of how she said them, like she was not asking him, but asking something older, something that did not need his answer. And he shifted in his seat, running a hand along the porch rail, feeling the worn wood under his palm, reminding himself that everything here had a beginning, and that beginning had his name on it. At least that was what he had believed for years, what everyone believed, because belief was easier than memory, and memory had a way of changing things men preferred to keep still. And across town, Lanterns began to glow one by one, small pockets of light pushing back the dark, but not far enough, not tonight. Because the horses in the stable down the road would not settle, their restless steps carrying through the quiet like a warning no one had words for, and a dog somewhere beyond the last house let out a long, low howl that stretched across the open land and came back thinner, as if something out there had taken a piece of it, and Caleb exhaled slowly, standing now, pacing once across the porch as if movement alone could shake the feeling loose, but it stayed, pressing just beneath the surface of everything, and out beyond the edge of town, where the land flattened into something endless. The night held its breath, and she had not gone far, not the way most would expect, because she stopped where the dirt changed color, where the ground darkened just enough to notice if you knew what to look for, and she stood there for a long moment, looking down, her hand lowering again to touch the soil, fingers pressing into it like it held a story only she could read, and when she rose, there was no hesitation left in her movements, only certainty, and behind her, the darkness shifted, not sudden, not loud, but steady, as shapes began to form at the edge of sight, riders emerging one by one, silent, deliberate, their presence filling the empty space without a single word spoken, and she did not turn to look at them right away, because she already knew they were there, had known long before the first hoof touched the ground, and back in Dry Creek, Caleb paused at the edge of his porch, his gaze fixed on that same road, though he could not yet see what was coming, only feel it, like the land itself had begun to move beneath everything he thought was solid, and for the first time in years, he did not feel like a man standing on something he owned, but a man standing on something that might be remembering him. Morning did not arrive the way it usually did in Dry Creek. There was no slow warming of the air, no easy stretch of light rolling over rooftops and fences. Instead it came sharp and still, like something placed carefully over the land, and the first man who stepped out onto the street noticed it without knowing why, his boots hitting the dirt softer than expected, the sound swallowed almost immediately, and he paused, looking out toward the open road where the horizon usually shimmered empty at that hour. But today it did not. Today there was a line there, thin at first, dark against the pale gold of early light, and he squinted, taking a step forward, then another, until the shape began to separate into pieces, movement, steady and measured, and he felt his throat tighten before he even understood what he was seeing, because there were too many, not a handful of riders passing through, not traders or drifters, but something else entirely, something that did not hurry and did not hesitate. And word traveled the way it always did in small towns, faster than footsteps, faster than reason, doors opening, voices calling low and uncertain, faces appearing in windows, and within minutes the street that had laughed the day before was filled again, but no one laughed now, not when the line on the horizon grew clearer, wider, until it stretched beyond what the eye could easily hold, riders upon riders, their silhouettes rising and falling with the rhythm of their horses, the sound reaching town not as noise but as a steady pulse, like the land itself had found a heartbeat, and Caleb Whitaker stepped out last, slower than the others, his hat pulled low, his posture the same as always, straight, unyielding, but something in his eyes had changed, something that watched instead of commanded, and he stood at the center of the street where he always stood, where decisions were made and followed, and he fixed his gaze on what was coming, counting without meaning to 10, then 20, then more than he could track, until counting stopped making sense, and still they came, filling the space between horizon and town with a presence that did not need to announce itself, and no one spoke because there was nothing to say that would fit the moment, not when certainty began to thin like mist under sunlight, and as the riders drew closer, details emerged, the way they sat their horses, the way they moved together without signal, the quiet that held them instead of words, and then, just before they reached the edge of Dry Creek, they slowed, not all at once, but as one, a gradual shift that settled into stillness so complete it felt deliberate, and from among them, she stepped forward again, the same woman from the day before, the same worn clothes, the same steady eyes, but nothing about her seemed small now, not with that silence behind her, not with the weight of every gaze in town fixed on her instead of on Caleb, and she walked a few steps into the street, stopping where the dust still held the faint imprint of her knees from the day before, and for a moment she said nothing, only looked down at the ground, then up again, her eyes meeting Caleb's with that same quiet certainty. And somewhere behind her, an older man shifted forward in the saddle, his voice carrying across the distance without effort, low and clear. "This land remembers." And the words did not echo. They settled, like something returning to where it belonged. And Caleb felt it then, not as fear, not yet, but as recognition pressing against something he had kept buried for years. Something tied to papers signed in rooms far from this dust, to lines drawn on maps. By men who never stood here, and he did not move, did not speak, because for the first time, the ground beneath him felt like it was waiting for something he could no longer control. No one moved when the words settled, not because they did not understand them, but because they understood them too well, and understanding has a way of stripping a man of the noise he hides behind, leaving only what is true. And Caleb Whitaker stood there in the center of Dry Creek with the weight of 100 silent eyes pressing in on him, his hand resting near his belt out of habit, not threat. A gesture learned over years of being the one others watched for direction, but now no one looked to him, not the men by the saloon, not the women standing in doorways, not even the boy who had laughed the loudest the day before, because their attention had shifted, pulled toward the woman who had knelt in their dust and now stood without asking for anything. And she took another step forward, slow, deliberate, until she stood close enough that the space between her and Caleb felt smaller than it should have, and she reached into the fold of her worn dress, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the same calm she had carried since the moment she entered their town. And when her hand came back into the light, it held something small, something that did not look like much at first, just a piece of folded paper, edges worn, surface marked by time. And yet the way she held it made the air tighten again, because objects only carry weight when someone knows what they mean. And she extended it toward Caleb without a word, not offering, not pleading, simply placing it between them like something returning to its place. And for a moment he did not take it, his eyes fixed on the paper as if it might disappear if he acknowledged it. Because there are things a man can ignore, and things he cannot. And this felt like the second kind, and slowly, almost against his own will, he reached out and took it, the texture rough beneath his fingers, the fold opening with a quiet sound that seemed louder than anything else in that stillness. And as his eyes moved across the lines, something inside him shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the way a foundation shifts when it realizes it has been resting on something unstable all along. And the words on that page were not new, not to him, but they were not something he had expected to see here, not in her hands, not in front of everyone who had believed his version of things without question. And behind her, the older writer spoke again, his voice carrying not authority alone, but memory. "It was recorded before your first fence post touched this ground," he said, and Caleb's jaw tightened, because he remembered the men in suits who had come through years ago, remembered the signatures, the assurances, the quiet understanding that some histories were easier left behind if no one came back to claim them. And he had built on that understanding, built fences, built homes, built a life that fit neatly over what had been there before, and for a long time, it had held, because no one had challenged it. No one had stood where she stood now and asked the question she had asked. And he looked up from the paper, his eyes meeting hers again, searching for something he could still control, some angle that would return things to the way they were. But there was nothing there to push against, no anger to dismiss, no desperation to exploit, only that same quiet certainty. And she spoke then, her voice low but clear enough that every person in Dry Creek heard it without strain. "You built something here," she said, not accusing, not praising, simply stating what was. "But you did not build the ground it stands on." And the words did not rise, did not fall. They settled, just like the ones before. And in that moment, Caleb understood something he had avoided for years, that ownership is easy when no one remembers, but memory has a way of returning, not loud, not violent, but patient. And when it does not ask permission to be believed. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something none of them could ignore anymore. Caleb did not fold the paper right away. He held it open in both hands as if the act of closing it might make the words inside settle into something final, something he could not reshape. And the sun had climbed higher now, pressing heat into the back of his neck, into the boards beneath his boots, into the stillness that had taken hold of Dry Creek, but he barely felt it, because the weight he carried in that moment did not come from the sky or the crowd. It came from memory, from signatures he had placed on documents he barely questioned, from boundaries he had drawn because no one stood there to contest them. And he had told himself then that this was how the world worked. That land belonged to those who had the means to claim it, to improve it, to make something out of it that others could see and believe in. And for years, that belief had gone unchallenged, had become truth simply because it was repeated often enough, loud enough, by enough people who benefited from it. And now that same belief stood in front of him, thinner than he remembered, fragile in a way he had never allowed himself to consider. And he finally lowered the paper, folding it once, carefully, not out of respect, but because he needed his hands to be doing something. And he looked at Ayano again, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at the dust on her skin, but at the way she stood, balanced, steady, like she belonged to the ground in a way he never had. And behind her the riders remained still, not shifting, not speaking, their silence heavier than any threat, because it did not ask for reaction. It simply waited. And waiting can be more powerful than force when a man realizes he is the one being measured. And Caleb cleared his throat, the sound dry, smaller than he intended, and when he spoke, his voice carried less certainty than it had the day before. "Papers can be wrong," he said, not loudly, not defiantly, but like a man reaching for something familiar in a place where nothing felt the same. And for a moment, no one answered him, not the townspeople, not the riders, not even Ayana. And that silence stretched just long enough for the words to lose whatever strength they had carried, because denial only holds when others agree to support it, and no one did. And she took one more step forward, closing the distance between them until there was nothing left to stand between truth and the man who had avoided it. And when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained steady, but it carried something deeper now, something rooted in time rather than argument. "Then look beyond the paper," she said, and she turned slightly, gesturing not to the riders behind her, but to the land itself, the stretch of dry earth, the low hills beyond, the riverbed that cut through the distance like a scar that had never fully healed. "Look at what was here before you named it." And the words landed differently, because they did not ask him to defend himself. They asked him to remember, and memory is harder to argue with than ink. And Caleb's gaze followed her gesture without thinking, tracing the lines of land he had walked 1,000 times, land he had fenced, divided, measured, but never truly seen beyond its use. And something shifted again, not in the crowd, not in the riders, but inside him, a quiet recognition that what he had built was real, but what it stood on had always been older, deeper, and never truly his to define. And he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it came, and for the first time since he had stepped into this town years ago, he did not feel like the man who decided what came next. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something already decided long before he arrived. And no one told him what to do. No one demanded anything, because they did not need to. The truth had already done the work, and the only thing left was whether he would stand against it, or step aside and let it be seen for what it was. Caleb did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything he could have forced into words, because for the first time, the town was not waiting for him. It was watching him. And there is a difference between being followed and being observed. One gives a man power, the other takes it away, and he felt that shift settle over his shoulders like a weight he could not shrug off, his fingers tightening slightly around the folded paper as if it might still change if he held it long enough. But nothing about this moment was changing, not the way the riders sat without moving, not the way the townspeople stood without speaking, not even the way the wind had stopped moving through the street, as if the land itself had decided this was not a moment to be rushed. And Caleb took a slow breath, letting it out through his nose, his eyes drifting once more across the buildings he had raised, the saloon, the fence lines, the water troughs, every piece of it carrying his effort, his decisions, his years. And for a second, Something like resistance flickered in him, not loud, not defiant, but stubborn. The kind that comes from a man who has spent too long believing that work alone makes something his. And he spoke again, quieter now. I paid for it, he said, not to the crowd, not even to her, but almost to himself, like he needed to hear it out loud to see if it still held weight. And Ayanna did not interrupt him, did not correct him. She simply watched, and that watching made the words feel smaller than they were, because truth does not need to argue, it only needs to remain. And after a moment, she stepped past him, not brushing against him, not forcing him aside, just moving forward in a way that made it clear she did not need his permission to stand where she chose. And she knelt again, in the same place where the dust still held the faint trace of the day before. But this time no one laughed, no one shifted, because they understood now that what they had mistaken for weakness had never been that at all. And she placed her hand flat against the ground, her fingers spreading slightly, pressing into the dry soil with a familiarity that felt older than the town itself. And when she spoke, her voice carried not across the crowd, but into it, steady, grounded. You paid for what was written, she said, but not for what was taken before it was written down. And those words did not accuse him. They did not seek to shame him. They simply placed a line between what could be owned and what could not. And Caleb felt that line more clearly than anything he had ever stood on, because it cut through years of assumption, through the quiet agreements that had built his life here, through the belief that if no one returned, then nothing had been left behind. And he looked down at her hand against the earth, at the way it rested there like it belonged. And for a moment, he tried to imagine placing his own hand there the same way, tried to feel what she felt, but all he found was distance, a gap between him and the ground that he had never noticed before. And that realization settled into him slowly, not like a blow, but like something inevitable, something that had been waiting for him to see it. And behind them, one of the riders shifted just slightly, the sound of leather against saddle breaking the stillness for the briefest second, not as a warning, not as pressure, but as a reminder that this moment was not just about one man or one town. It was about something larger, something that had outlasted all of them. And Caleb straightened just a little, his posture no longer rigid, no longer fixed in the way of a man defending his place, but looser, uncertain in a way that felt unfamiliar. And he looked at the people around him, really looked this time, seeing not just faces that had followed him, but faces that were now searching for something else, something he could not give them anymore. And when his gaze returned to Ayanna, there was no anger left in it, no attempt to reclaim control, only the quiet understanding of a man who had finally seen the edge of what he could claim and realized it had never reached as far as he believed. The town did not return to itself after that moment. It could not, because once a man sees something clearly, he cannot pretend it is not there anymore. And Caleb Whitaker stood in the same place he had always stood, but it no longer felt like his place, not in the way it had the day before, not even in the way it had an hour ago. And the paper in his hand had grown heavier without changing at all, as if the truth inside it had found its full weight now that it had been spoken out loud. And he looked down at it one more time, not searching for an error, not hoping for a mistake, but simply acknowledging what it was, a record of something that had existed before him, something that had been pushed aside, renamed, and forgotten because forgetting had been easier for everyone involved. And he folded it again, slower this time, more deliberate, then held it out toward Ayanna without a word. And she accepted it just as quietly, not like a victory, not like a claim, but like something returning to where it belonged. And the space between them shifted again, not tense, not hostile, but resolved in a way that did not need explanation. And Caleb stepped back, not because he was told to, not because anyone forced him, but because he understood that staying where he was no longer made sense. And that movement, small as it was, carried through the town like a ripple, because the man who had never stepped aside for anything had just done so without argument, without resistance. And people noticed, not loudly, not with whispers or gasps, but in the way their posture changed, in the way their eyes moved, in the way the air itself seemed to loosen just slightly. And Ayanna rose from where she had knelt, brushing the dust from her hands, not hurried, not careful, just as someone would who had finished what they came to do. And she turned her gaze across Dry Creek, not judging, not condemning, simply seeing it for what it was, a place built with effort, with intention, but also with absence, with something missing beneath it that no one had acknowledged until now. And behind her, the riders remained where they were, still as the horizon itself, waiting not for orders, but for the moment to complete itself. And Caleb took another step back, then another, until he was no longer at the center of the street, no longer the point everything aligned around. And he felt the shift settle into him fully this time, not as loss alone, but as clarity, the kind that does not comfort, but does not lie either. And he looked once more at the buildings, the fences, the land stretching beyond them. And for the first time, he saw it not as something he had shaped, but as something that had allowed him to build upon it for a time. And that time had now come to its natural end, not through force, not through conflict, but through recognition. And he reached up, adjusting his hat slightly, the motion familiar, steady, the last piece of himself that had not changed. And then he turned, not toward the crowd, not toward the saloon, but toward the road that led out of Dry Creek, the same road he had once arrived on years ago, full of certainty, full of plans. And now he walked it again, slower, quieter, each step carrying a different kind of weight, not the weight of ambition, but the weight of understanding. And no one stopped him, no one called after him, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. And behind him, the town remained, the riders remained, and Ayanna stood at the center of it all, not as someone who had taken anything, but as someone who had revealed what had always been there, waiting, patient, until someone finally chose to see it. The sound of his boots faded slowly along the road, not because the distance was great, but because no one in Dry Creek dared to fill the silence he left behind. And that silence stretched, settled, and reshaped the space he once occupied, until it no longer felt like something missing, but something restored. And Ayanna remained where she stood, not watching him leave, not measuring his steps, because her part in that moment had never been about the man walking away. It had always been about what stayed. And she turned her gaze back to the town, to the buildings that stood firm under the weight of years, to the people who now stood without knowing exactly where to place themselves. And she saw it clearly, not as something to claim, not as something to take, but as something caught between what it had been told and what it truly was. And she stepped forward again, her boots pressing into the same dust that had once marked her as an outsider, but now held no such meaning. And she stopped near the center, where the ground felt familiar beneath her, where the faint impression of her earlier kneeling had already begun to fade into the rest of the earth. And she lowered her hand once more, touching the soil in a gesture that no longer needed explanation, because everyone watching understood, not fully, not in words, but in feeling, that this was not about a single moment. It was about a connection that had never been broken, only ignored. And behind her, the riders finally shifted, not in tension, not in urgency, but in quiet acknowledgement, a subtle movement of reins, a turning of heads, as if the land itself had spoken and they had heard enough. And the older man who had spoken before guided his horse a few steps forward, his presence steady, his voice carrying just enough to reach those who needed to hear it. "What stands here can remain," he said, not as permission, not as command, but as truth, if it remembers what stands beneath it. And those words moved through the town differently than anything that had come before, because they did not threaten, they did not demand removal or surrender. They asked for something harder, something quieter. They asked for acknowledgement, for a change not in structure, but in understanding. And the people of Dry Creek felt that weight settle in, not as fear, but as responsibility. And one by one, their posture shifted, shoulders lowering, eyes no longer searching for direction, but beginning to look inward. And Ayanna rose again, brushing her hand lightly against her dress, the dust falling away in small, quiet trails. And she turned, not away from the town, but alongside it, as if aligning herself with something that had always been there. And for a moment, everything stood still, the riders, the townspeople, the buildings, the land itself holding that silence like a breath not yet released. And then, without signal, without sound, the riders began to turn, not all at once, but in a slow, unified motion, their horses shifting direction toward the open horizon. And the movement carried no urgency, no triumph, only completion. as if something long delayed had finally been set right. And Iona stepped forward to join them, her pace steady, her gaze forward, leaving behind not a mark of conquest, but something far more lasting, a truth that would remain long after the dust settled again. And as she reached the edge of town, she paused for the briefest moment, not to look back, but to listen, as if the ground itself had something left to say. And then she continued on, disappearing into the same open land she had come from. And Dry Creek stood in her absence, unchanged in form, but no longer the same, because now, beneath every step, beneath every wall, beneath every quiet decision yet to be made, there was something remembered, something that could no longer be ignored, something that would shape what came next without ever raising its voice. The dust settled long after the riders disappeared, but the silence they left behind did not fade with it. It stayed, stretched thin across Dry Creek like something unseen but undeniable. And for the first time since the town had been built, people did not rush back into their routines, did not fill the street with noise or laughter to push away what had happened. Instead, they stood where they were, looking at the ground beneath their boots as if it might answer something they had never thought to ask before. And the space at the center of town, where Caleb had once stood without question, remained empty, not avoided, not feared, just left untouched, as if no one quite knew who should stand there now, or if anyone should at all. And the sun moved slowly overhead, casting new shadows that did not quite match the ones from the day before, because something had shifted in the way people saw the place they lived, not the buildings, not the fences, but the meaning beneath them. And an older woman stepped forward first, her movements careful, deliberate, as she walked toward the well, her eyes lingering on the ground before she lowered the bucket, not as a habit, but as a choice. And others followed in small ways, subtle at first, a man removing his hat before stepping onto the street, a child asking a question that no one had a simple answer for. And those small moments began to gather, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something rebuilding itself from a different understanding. And out beyond the edge of town, the road stretched long and quiet, carrying Caleb farther with each step, his figure growing smaller against the wide land. And he did not look back, not because he could not, but because he knew what he would see, not the town as it had been, but the truth of it. And that truth no longer needed his presence to exist, and his pace did not quicken, did not slow, it remained steady. The rhythm of a man who had stopped trying to outrun what he had finally understood, and behind him, Dry Creek remained, not reclaimed, not taken, but changed in a way that could not be undone. And though no one spoke her name, though no marker stood where she had knelt, the memory of that moment settled into the land itself, carried in every step, every decision, every quiet acknowledgement that followed. And as the day stretched on, the town began to move again, not as it had before, but with a different kind of awareness, one that did not erase what had been built, but no longer ignored what had been there first. And far out on the horizon, where the riders had vanished, the land remained open, endless, holding its silence like a promise, not of return, but of remembrance, the kind that does not demand, does not force, but waits, patient and steady, for those willing to see it. Time moved differently after that day, not slower, not faster, but heavier, as if every hour carried something that had not been there before. And Dry Creek began to settle into a new rhythm that no one had planned and no one spoke about. Because there are changes that do not need words to exist. They show themselves in the way a man walks, in the way a door is opened, in the way silence is allowed to remain instead of being filled. And the empty space at the center of town did not stay empty for long, but it was never the same again. Not a place of command, not a place where one voice stood above the rest, but something quieter, something shared, and people passed through it without stopping, without claiming it, as if they understood that some spaces are not meant to belong to anyone. And the well became the place where conversations happened, not loud, not certain, but honest in a way that had not existed before. Questions asked without immediate answers, stories remembered that had once been set aside. And even the children began to notice, their games slower, their eyes more curious when they wandered near the edge of town, looking out toward the land that had always been there, but now seemed to hold something more than distance. And far along that same road, Caleb Whitaker walked until the shape of Dry Creek had disappeared behind him, until the buildings became memory instead of sight. And he stopped once, only once, not to turn back, but to rest his hand against the brim of his hat, holding it there for a moment as if steadying something inside himself. And he looked out across the open land, not measuring it, not planning what could be built, but simply seeing it, wide, unclaimed in the way he now understood that word. And for the first time in years, he felt something loosen inside him, not relief, not regret alone, but something quieter, something closer to acceptance. And he lowered his hand, adjusting his hat back into place before continuing forward, his steps no longer carrying the urgency of ownership, but the weight of a man who had learned where his path truly began. And back in Dry Creek, small changes continued to take root. A fence repaired, but left slightly open where it met the land beyond. A marker placed near the edge of town, not to divide, but to remember. A simple sign carved by hand that did not claim the land, but named it as it had once been known, Redbird Land. And no one argued over it, not because they fully understood, but because they no longer felt the need to deny it. And as the days passed, the town did not shrink, did not fall apart. It remained, but it held itself differently, lighter in some ways, more aware in others. And the wind returned, moving through the streets again, carrying dust, carrying voices, carrying the quiet understanding that had settled into every corner. And sometimes, at the edge of morning or just before night fell, someone would pause and look out toward the horizon, not expecting anything to return, not waiting for riders or for answers, but simply acknowledging what lay beyond their reach. And beneath their feet, the ground remained steady, not changed by ownership, not altered by names, but present in a way that no one could ignore anymore. And though no one spoke it aloud, they all felt it, that what had happened was not an ending, but a correction, something that had always been waiting for its moment. And when it came, it did not break the town, it revealed it, and left behind a silence that was no longer empty, but full of something worth carrying forward. There comes a point when a place stops being what it was told to be and starts becoming what it truly is. And in Dry Creek, that point did not arrive with noise or announcement. It settled in quietly, carried in small decisions that no one would have noticed before. And over time, those decisions began to shape something new, not in the buildings or the fences, but in the way people held themselves within them. And the sign at the edge of town weathered under the sun and wind, its carved letters, deepening with time instead of fading, as if the name it carried had been waiting longer than the wood itself. And travelers who passed through began to pause when they saw it, not because it warned them away, but because it asked something of them, something they could not quite put into words. And those who entered Dry Creek did so with a different kind of awareness, their eyes lingering a moment longer on the land, their steps a little slower, as if they understood they were walking into a place that remembered more than it showed. And the people who lived there noticed the change not as something foreign, but as something that felt right in a way they had not known before. And the stories that began to circulate were not about conflict or loss, but about that single moment in the street, about the way one woman had knelt in the dust and revealed something no one else had seen. And though her name was not spoken often, it was not forgotten either. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the glances toward the horizon, in the quiet respect that replaced the laughter that once filled that space. And far from the town, beyond where the road narrowed and the land opened into something endless, Caleb Whitaker found himself stopping again, this time not out of habit, but because something inside him had shifted enough to require stillness. And he stood there for a long moment, looking out across the land that no longer felt like something to be claimed, but something to be understood. And the wind moved across it in long, steady currents, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass, the same scent he had known for years. But now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. And he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against something small, something he had not realized he had kept, the coin he had thrown into the dust that day. And he pulled it out, turning it in his hand as the light caught its surface. And for a moment, he saw it not as something given or taken, but as a symbol of what he had once believed. And without hesitation, he lowered his hand and let it fall into the earth at his feet, the metal disappearing into the dust without sound. without resistance, and he did not watch where it landed, because it no longer mattered, and he straightened, drawing a slow breath before stepping forward again, his path leading not back, but onward, and in Dry Creek. The same wind that touched him moved through the town, stirring the edges of the sign, brushing against the buildings, carrying with it the quiet understanding that had taken root, and no one needed to speak it, because it was already there, in the way they lived, in the way they remembered, in the way they chose to stand on the land without trying to own what lay beneath it. And as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long once more, the town settled into itself, not as it had been, but as it had always been meant to be, a place that held both what was built and what could never be taken, side by side, without conflict, without denial, simply existing in the kind of balance that only comes when truth is no longer hidden. Seasons began to pass in ways that made time feel less like something measured and more like something remembered, and Dry Creek carried those seasons differently now, each one settling into the land, without trying to overwrite what had come before, and the sign at the edge of town stood through sun and wind and the rare rain that softened the ground just enough to remind everyone that the land still had its own rhythm, its own way of holding and releasing what was given to it, and travelers who arrived months later no longer saw a town built on certainty. They saw a place that listened, a place where people paused before speaking, where decisions were made with an awareness that reached beyond the next fence line. And the stories that were told about the town changed as well, no longer centered on what had been built, but on what had been recognized, on the moment when something invisible became undeniable. And though the woman who had brought that moment had not returned, her presence lingered in ways that could not be traced to a single memory. It was in the way hands touched the ground before setting a post, in the way eyes lifted toward the horizon, without expectation but with acknowledgement, and the town did not try to claim that presence, did not name it or shape it into something smaller. They allowed it to remain as it was, quiet and steady, and far from Dry Creek, beyond the stretches of land that no longer felt empty, but full of something unseen. Caleb Whitaker had built nothing new, had claimed nothing, but he had learned to move differently through the world, not as a man seeking to leave his mark on everything he touched, but as someone who understood that not all ground is meant to carry the weight of ownership, and he found himself drawn to places where the land spoke in the same quiet way, where the wind carried stories that did not belong to him, but did not exclude him either. And sometimes, when the light fell just right across the open plains, he would stop and listen, not for voices, not for answers, but for the absence of noise that had once filled his life. And in that absence, he found something steadier than certainty, something that did not depend on control or claim. And back in Dry Creek, the people no longer needed reminders of what had happened, because it had become part of how they saw everything around them, not as a lesson repeated, but as a truth lived, and the land beneath them remained unchanged in form, but no longer unseen, no longer taken for granted. And as the years continued to move forward, the town did not grow larger, did not reach outward to claim more. It remained within its boundaries, but those boundaries no longer felt like ownership. They felt like understanding, and in that understanding, there was a kind of peace that had not existed before, a quiet balance between what had been built and what had always been there, and no one tried to explain it, because some things lose their meaning when forced into words, and this was not something that needed to be explained. It only needed to be remembered, in the way people stood, in the way they lived, and in the way they allowed the land beneath them to remain what it had always been, something that could be shared, respected, and seen without ever truly being owned. Years later, when the boards of the old saloon had been replaced twice and the well had been deepened to meet the quieter water below, people in Dry Creek still moved with that same unspoken awareness, not as a burden, but as a habit that had settled into their bones. And if you asked them when things had changed, they would not point to a date or a season. They would simply pause, glance toward the center of town, and let the silence answer for them, because some moments do not live in time. They live in the way everything after them feels different, and the place where she had knelt never held a marker, never carried a sign, but no one stepped there without noticing, without feeling the faint weight of something remembered. And children who had not been there that day grew up hearing the story not as a warning, not as a tale of loss, but as something steadier, something that shaped how they understood the ground beneath their feet. And when they asked who she was, the answers were always simple, always the same. She was someone who knew, and that was enough, because knowing had proven stronger than anything else that day, stronger than ownership, stronger than pride, stronger than the need to be right. And far from Dry Creek, where the land stretched wide and open without fences to define it, Caleb Whitaker had long since stopped measuring distance in miles or time in years. He measured it in understanding, in the quiet space between what he once believed and what he had learned to see. And sometimes, when the wind moved across the plains just right, carrying that same dry scent of dust and sun-warmed earth, he would close his eyes for a moment, not to remember the town as it had been, but to acknowledge what it had become and what he had become beyond it. And he no longer felt the need to return, not out of pride, not out of distance, but because he understood that some places are not meant to be revisited once they have shown you the truth you needed. They are meant to remain as they are, whole in their own way. And Dry Creek remained, not as a place claimed or taken, but as a place that had learned to stand without denying what lay beneath it. And in that standing, there was a kind of strength that did not need to prove itself, did not need to be defended, because it was rooted in something deeper than any structure built above it. And on certain mornings, when the light stretched low across the land and the shadows held just a little longer than usual, it almost felt as if the ground itself breathed differently there, steady and patient, carrying forward everything it had always known. And if you stood still long enough, if you listened without trying to name what you heard, you might understand what they had come to understand, that nothing she took had ever belonged to him, and nothing he lost had ever truly been his to begin with. And out here, where the wind does not ask and the land does not answer, that is the only kind of truth that lasts.